We have 4 microphones. I will hog one. And then there is one there, I think one over there somewhere, and a 4th one is somewhere sort of around as well.
Cyrus?
Yes?
Are we getting our marching orders now?
Yes, listen up. And Rebecca is on as well. I hope she can hear us. She is on. Perfect. Hi, Rebecca. And please chime in whenever you want. Okay. So I wanted to start by saying thank you again to Irina Dubois for all your support. Thank you very much. You can see this was an extremely interesting and productive meeting, and I know that it really will improve this companion volume that we are putting out. So thank you very much again. Thank you also very much again to all the student assistants who were here, those who are here now and those who already had to leave. And definitely, last but not least, thank you all so much, because it was not only a really productive, but also a really pleasant sort of 2 days for me. And, it doesn't always happen this way. So it's really great that we could come together. I am going to, through the next week, and definitely by next week, I'm going to write all of you with feedback where I sort of pull together some of the points raised in the discussion and some of the points I have myself. In certain cases, I may CC other chapter authors in case there is a sort of an overlap. Not to say that you need to decide who does what, because I do think certain overlaps are actually really interesting, but to just so that people have an idea of what's going on, because I think that's just like good to know, keep you informed, yeah? I also will, at the very end of the production process, I'm sure CUP will allow us to do this, I would like to build into the texts, the main body of the text, and this will need to happen once we have basically the proofs already and done. I would like to make cross-references between chapters. Simply, like in parentheses, see page number 1 or page number whatever it is, so that the reader sort of, is able to go back and forth. So we can do different things, of course, in this debrief, right? We definitely can, bore down into particular points again. If somebody wants to do this, by all means. I also think, though, that what's really important is to think about these larger questions of structure, questions of, relationships between the different chapters. And there are different ways of doing this. I think one of the main questions I have is, are there different ways of thinking top-down about the Cold War in the Middle East? So we, again, to just mention this very explicitly again, we have the primacy argument, right? Then we have an argument that the Soviet Union did play perhaps more of a role in certain cases. Not that Osama, that you mentioned, that you said it doesn't play any role, definitely not. But in certain cases, maybe more, in certain cases, maybe less. So even the global Cold War lens is not, I don't think, is homogeneous. There are different versions of it, depending on where you look at, which field, and maybe also which time you look at. Then same thing with the bottom-up, right? There are different ways of doing the bottom-up, and so same thing there. For me, where it gets really interesting is the question, where do these two meet and where they do become the same? And I think when I think about the way in which I structured the companion to start with, namely into 2 parts, one is basically top-down, and then the second one is basically bottom-up. So we had a long discussion yesterday over dinner, and maybe I will sort of try to redo this. I don't quite know yet how, but I do think that some of the things that we saw here in the last 2 days points to the fact that very often you can see overlaps. They are not everywhere, but they are in certain points, like in certain points in certain cases. So we can talk about anything, but I think it would be interesting if maybe we could also maybe just like go around and see how you think your chapter specifically relates to the whole. Yes, and maybe that's actually the most productive way of doing this, because I think everybody is most connected to their own chapter, right? So how do you see your chapter fitting into this larger whole? What do you think about this? So we are still 2, 4, 6, 8. We are about like 13, I think, left. So maybe if just everybody could maybe talk for 3-4 minutes, I think that would be a good idea. But we can also chime in, so that it's not just like one after the other. Yeah. So, do you want to start?
That to me? Okay.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, by all means.
Can you tell us? Have you thought about what the structure of the book is going to be?
Yes, that's exactly what I tried to say before. So before I thought that there are these 2 parts, right? Part number 1 is basically principally external actors and political, though the state actors in the Middle East play a big role as well. And then the second part, was the first day yesterday, and then the second part today was basically more sort of the local actors and more societal. Sorry.
I'm just going straight to the context.
Yeah.
What is the order in your mind that we see here?
That was the order I thought of. Now I'm not so sure anymore. Because this also signals something. And what this signals is that the external actors and the political comes first, and everything else comes second. And I think we have seen that this is an also problematic way of looking at it. So maybe I will go back and forth, and maybe I will not do 2 parts, but simply 1 single part. It's also, there are not too many chapters here. But I'm not sure yet. I may stick to the old one or do yet something else. I'll see.
Have you mentioned you were going to give us a new page count?
Yes. Yes.
Can you repeat the question so Rebecca can hear?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I mean,
Or actually over there.
the word count?
So I don't know if Rebecca
Yes.
heard the first. Do you need to repeat that for Rebecca?
That
Yes.
would be wonderful. Thank you.
Word count. The word count, right?
Yeah. Well, one was the word count. Then I have another question for you.
The original one was 8,000, but now because we have basically, I think, I know formally 1 chapter is out, and most probably a second chapter will be out as well. That means that there is, like, let's say 20,000, words more. So I think everybody will probably be able to go to 9 or maybe 9.5, something like this. But I will let you know definitely once I email you, okay? So that you know, definitely. Also, deadline, the original deadline was late March, was late May,
Yeah.
okay? But I'm going to tell Cambridge University Press that we need more time.
Okay.
Okay? So I think it would make sense that we say maybe September after the summer holidays.
Well, that's your summer holiday.
That's-
Those of us in the U.S. don't have that, but that's
That-
we're not all
Well,
sitting here in
but
Geneva. So
everybody has already written really great drafts. So you already have a first draft, right? So you don't need to do too much. Yeah.
Now, can I ask, and I think this may apply to some others as well, maps, illustrations, graphics, how much leeway do we have? Do we have any?
We do. So we have in principle, I think, 2 per chapter.
Oh, okay.
Yes, but I have to double check this, and I will get back to you. This is only the original emails that you got. I think it's all there, but I will double check again. I also think that definitely Holiday will need. She will need to get some of those. She can take yours and yeah, exactly, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's all.
Perry.
Okay, how does mine relate to the rest? Wow. I really liked your intervention about thinking about the macro historical processes and how they intersect with the Cold War. So I am thinking about that. I don't know if this is answering the question, but and then the thing that's very confusing about gender is that it both has this top-down element to it, but also the grassroots element that kind of sort of maps onto the socialist-capitalist divide, but not always. No, it doesn't map onto it. I don't know. There's like state feminism. There's grassroots. So, I can imagine like pulling those out, and also maybe making connections to what everyone else is doing. But yeah, I'll keep thinking about that. Another thing that makes mine really confusing is like I'm talking about women actors, which is not the same thing as gender. And, you know, I think politics is gendered in all of these papers, but women aren't necessarily actors, but then sources about men are also sources about women. This wasn't a very good answer, but this is what I'm thinking, kind of.
Yeah. So I could, for instance, imagine, you know, 2 or 3 cross-references in your chapter to certain instances, even in the really high politics chapters, where something is very self-evidently gendered, right? And so maybe one could have just to get examples from within the volume, and we can think about like how this would look like, yeah, by simply talking together, yeah. Do you guys want to continue over there? Here's the thing.
So I've been taking notes about how it intersects with some of the other chapters that have been going along, so that's already there. I mean, I think it, you know, and I can just build on that as going through some of the drafts that we have already. I mean, I think there's a number of intersection points I can add in. I deliberately didn't use a lot of primary sources based on some of our early discussions, but I'm going to bring a few in, and I'm going to bring in some more gendered language that'll point to yours, especially, I mean, there's, over and over again, especially the early stuff is all about penetration, you know, so, you know, I can, it pretty much.
I don't see the relation.
You don't see, I mean, you've got a lot of penetration in your chapter too, so this is, you know, we can, you know, that, but again, I think it intersects with a number of different ones, and positively or negatively, and I think I can find some clarifying points that may help, but.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, I have the latest part of my piece about Islam coming out of the new left, I think should be connected to themes. Lorena and Massimiliano, you know, kind of like can integrate it. I could see how that comes together. But otherwise, in terms of kind of structure, you know, I realize, you know, there is kind of an effort to refine kind of a structural kind of explanation for the, you know, for the Cold War in the Middle East, kind of, and I a little bit kind of resist that, like in the sense of like, this could be crossed in many shapes and forms, which you know, it's a little bit like a hologram. You can look at it from many directions. You see different things, which I think is part of its beauty. Yes. So perhaps pointing into some of these direction, thought to begin with and abstractions to begin with really resist, you know, this kind of be packaged in such a way. But part of it is really like, if you tell me where you're gonna put it in the book, that's gonna help me. Because for me, art, ideas, and gender is this kind of separate thing. I'm not sure that the natural place where necessarily this work can, you know, can do its work.
Yeah. Shall I quickly jump in here? Yeah. No, I have one here. So I think look, every order of chapters in a table of contents and hence in the book has its pros and its cons, its advantages and disadvantages. I do think that the advantage of having one single part and no divisions is exactly that there is that we do not implicitly suggest that there is a clear division here between something that is primary, that might be, right now, that's the top-down political state-driven, and something that comes later, that's part 2. We literally call it, I literally called it part 2, right? So I think it really makes sense to sort of zigzag between different chapters, maybe between chapters that are now chapters in part 1 and chapters that are now in part 2. That's one thing I would say. Another thing that I would say is about readers. Look, let's be honest. This in the end, this is going to be an ebook as well. People will read chapters, and in the end, the order in the end also will not matter that much. Yes, in the introduction, I like to do this stuff, you know this. So I will explicitly talk about this a lot, probably more than a lot of people will like, right? That's not. Yeah. And what I wanted to say before is you're totally right, and I totally agree. The Cold War, and I think Mina is a great example that shows that the Cold War is not one single thing, right? And a lot of Cold War historians say this, but it's also more than simply a top-down and a bottom-up thing. It's multiple top-downs and multiple bottom-ups, and very often they really are the same thing. It's like looking at the same thing from two different directions, as it were. So this definitely needs to be thematized. Sorry, just to... Chris.
I think there's a lot of interesting connections for me and Arabella. The panel that we were on, I think in the environment and development sides are in close discussion with her interest in the development of oil cities and different movements. So I think that's one clear connection. Clearly, there is a connection with Arab-Israeli conflict because it sets off every energy crisis that there is, every embargo, whether it's successful or not. And also, of course, with the two Cold War chapters, and I think there'll have to be a little bit of coordination there between the three of us, because Guy's chapter has a lot on oil, and I think is really oily in that way, whereas Osama's doesn't have quite as much. It's sort of a backdrop or a given,
Because I figured you were going to cover a lot, so I backed off a little.
Yeah, and whereas I think we're leaning more towards looking at it from the sort of OPEC development perspective, with case studies of different oil producers, sort of interspersed in there, and the creation of those regional connections. But of course, the role of U.S. oil companies and of the Cold War imperative is also something we have to mention. So I think we'll have to do another draft. In our case, do a full draft, and then see sort of what the actual conversations are at that point. I'm glad to have the later due date in order to facilitate that. Yeah.
I can do, Chris. I can send you a copy.
Yeah.
And then just tell me.
Yeah, super. Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks, Cyrus. First, I'm glad that you mentioned a second ago multiple top-downs and multiple bottoms-up, because I was going to say, I'm not always sure when you say top-down and bottom-up what you mean. So, for instance, sometimes it's been used, it seems like, to be state-driven versus either society or masses or individuals, but sometimes it's used to be Soviet and U.S. action is top-down and local actors are bottom-up, and I'm sure there's many other meanings, so I appreciate that you said that. And before I say about my chapter, I also wanted to add at lunch some questions about what is MENA, like literally how is it defined in the chapter? Is that something in the book? Is that something you're going to address in the introduction at all? Does it matter if we have different understandings of what the geography of MENA is, or is that just...
There are two answers to this. So there is a very practical answer, right? The very practical answer is that they wanted Middle East and North Africa. I do think in some ways this makes sense, just as a shorthand. And we define this broadly. That means Afghanistan and Pakistan and Turkey and Iran are in. Okay, Sudan is also in. We go all the way to Morocco. Even if somebody wants Mauritania, that's fine. And we have talked about this, like with different people. That's the practical answer. And then the more conceptual answer is that yes, one of the things I will address specifically and explicitly is the question of changing geographical imaginaries and also realities, right? Because certain North African realities are actually separate from Middle Eastern realities, but sometimes they also come together. So this is definitely something I will address. And thirdly, for me, it's not at all a problem that you will have different focal points in your different chapters. Nobody can cover everything, and nobody needs to think that they need to define MENA exactly in the same way. I think that would be too artificial.
Perfect, thank you. So in terms of my specific chapter, I just have a few incoherent thoughts. One is, it did pop up in a number of chapters, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and just a general question I was thinking about was why do these watershed moments stand out from the Arab-Israeli conflict more so than some other potential, I don't know, thinking the extent to which that's a scholarly, but I don't think it's a scholarly artifice. I don't have any answers to that. The second thing was, it's your volume, but there's a part of me, and I maybe regret saying this, there's a part of me that feels like there's a temptation in some ways for some of these seminal events to make sure that my chapter has a basic reprise, because there may be readers who don't fully grasp that they're coming to this volume, unless it's only expected that experts are going to come to this volume. But if graduate students, if non-experts, undergraduates are going to come to it, maybe there needs to be a place for a basic reprise brief of some of these seminal events, to make sure that when people make that quick reference to 56 or 67, there's a place that someone who can go to. Now, maybe that's irrelevant in the information age we live in, or maybe it's more relevant in the information age we live in. I don't know. I just threw that out there. And then lastly, and this isn't really specific to Arab-Israeli conflict, but since I was among many people here thinking about local agency and the decision-making of particular actors, I'm very interested to go back and read lots of chapters, and with that lens in mind, and see how people, it doesn't work for every chapter, but for many of the chapters, the lens of how people are talking about where is the locus of decision-making, who's making the final decision, and what's the relative weight of different actors in that, and just to think about many of the different examples that pop up.
Just very quickly about the seminal events list. I think, in principle, the chapters themselves ought to be fundamental and foundational enough for them to cover the events that, as it were, for you, in your story and in your mind, matter enough to be in a chapter of 8,000 words. So I think, in a sense, I think that should do this, as it were. I'm not so sure that I would want to add, maybe I will, I have to think about this more, but if I add in the introduction a seminal events list, I immediately need to start picking and choosing. And that in and by itself may round counter to the whole idea that we discussed before, that there is not one single Cold War, but many different ways of thinking about this. So I could do a super long list of 200 different things. A timeline, that in the intro, that is something one could do. Yes, exactly. One could do this. Then I would need to think about how also timelines very often work. No, I'm not against this, but the problem with a timeline is that very often it's political, military events, economic events that have a date, while longer sociocultural developments very often don't. They're very often stretches. But that doesn't mean one shouldn't do it. One just needs to think hard about how to represent this in the timeline, which is an interesting challenge. So, yes, maybe one could do this. Yes, it's a good point. Sorry, Tim.
Yeah, thanks everybody for their thoughts, and I just want to echo the consensus that this was, not only intellectually stimulating, but very nice people. So thanks for bringing us all together. Yeah, in terms of thoughts after 2 very rich days, I think one obvious point of connection, or perhaps mirror imaging, is between mine and Yoav's paper. I was struck very much, Yoav, by your remark at the beginning of the presentation of how it's very difficult to identify a body of Arab thought that was clearly influenced by the Cold War. I think here Islamism is almost the exception that proves your rule. You can say, okay, Arab liberalism, Arab monarchism, sure, these were changed by Cold War tensions, but these things, predated it. Whereas Islamism, Islamism also predated the Cold War, I guess, but it was, I think, the most dramatically changed. So I see a kind of productive mirror image pattern there. I think there's interesting connections between mine and Breen's piece. To the extent that we have a bit more wiggle room, I think discussing more the transformation or reinvention of Zainab as a crucial figure in Shia thought is a obvious move. I think that the really creative gender reinventions of Shariati and his followers are one of the many things that helps make the Iranian Shia project distinctive. There's also interesting contrasts between them and Turkish Islamists. A lot of my guys are always criticizing the Turkish Islamists for being too focused on how you should shave certain body parts or bathe or so on, that these guys are not really interested in a real ideology. And I think thirdly and finally, I'm not quite sure if I can express this well, but I think back to Arnie Westad's, I think, The Cold War, A World History, like the most recent bigger one. And if I remember correctly, in the introduction, he makes the observation that part of what the Cold War is about is, since circa 1870 or so, you have this conflict between capital and labor, basically. And we can also throw in a world that's divided by imperialism. And a lot of what happens over the next century is this conflict getting worked out in various domestic contexts. You talked about Latin America's little Cold Wars and social inequality inside of countries. But then there's also the great power competition piece as well, which connects with Osama's story. And it seems to me that a thread that ran through a lot of the second day was Holiday's piece on art, Yoav's piece on Arab liberals or conservatives, my piece on different visions of Islamism. You have a lot of these sort of domestic disputes or domestic workings out of social and economic tensions or the relation to an imperial system. And I think how we connect that with these top-down approaches is a challenge. I think Osama's line, at least as of last night in the hotel lobby, was that a lot of leftists and anti-imperialists see the United States as something that's connected to everything and is facilitating and intensifying these local inequalities. But that seems to me to be a kind of an open question as we refine the pieces.
If I can just add to that.
Yep.
And I think
Thanks. I think something to think about, and I mentioned this in my piece very briefly, but it's in my new book, but also draws on Kyle Burke, which is, it's not just that the leftists see this, but in the United States, you also get a conservative counterreaction, right? Which is they see this language of global revolution and say, we are going to oppose this, right? And so and one of the models is Israel. Right, so one of the things I talk about in the new book is that you'll see South Africa, you'll see some of the Latin American dictatorships say, not only do we want the relationship that Israel has with the United States, but we want to enact their policy. So South Africa has its own 1982 version of, for example, Southwest Africa, right? So they'll do certain and they'll do certain actions like that, seeing them as successful, right? So, I think it's not. I know there was some confusion about the primacy argument, but one of the things to keep in mind is that there is a very definite view of how leftists viewed the United States' role in the region, but also how conservatives viewed that left-wing movement. And I think that's, for those of you who are working on it, something to think about. Sorry.
Maybe you want to go next, Sharon?
So I would say First of all, 2 comments, I think, on our chapter, and I think Bill will go, and then one, I think, broader comment on something I think that might be missing from the book. So I'll be very brief because I'm sort of losing my voice. So I would say one is, in terms of top-down, bottom-up, I think, as Jeremy said, one version of that is superpowers, regional actors. I think, our chapter as, the China chapter, I think as a middle power, I think connects potentially the chapter of the 2 Germanys and the Britain and France chapter as middle powers that act laterally and, are not superpowers or regional powers. I think we connect them to those 2 chapters in certain ways. And of course, there are other missing powers that could be there, but at least, Germany and Britain and France are there. So I connect to those. I think the second thing is, I think we can really sort of expand or strengthen the Maoism-Islamism connection and tie that to Tim and Yoav's work. I think that's really important. I think the third thing, especially coming out of just what Osama said, is I think, to me, there's a major lacuna in the book, I think, which is, I like Guy's chapter a lot on, the Soviets and oil. But I don't think it really serves as a comprehensive picture of the Soviet activity in the region. I think so, in that sense, right, there is no Soviet chapter that parallels Osama's chapter in terms of what the Soviet Union is really doing overall, how it's promoting revolution, right, how it's, because the Soviet Union has many interests in the region besides oil. It's active in supporting many actors who don't have much to do with oil. So, like, a lot of the leftist actors that Osama's talking about are tied to the USSR, are supported by the USSR, are connected to the USSR, visit the USSR, and that is all missing from the book. So I think really the book needs another broader Soviet chapter to sort of parallel Osama's chapter.
Or Guy and I will have to talk.
Should I just jump in as the other half of that comment? I mean, you did a lot of, exactly, I completely agree. I think that the biggest connections are between Tim and Yoav's chapters, and especially strengthening those connections with the Islamist movement is really helpful. One thing I was thinking about, and this middle power discussion kind of ties into that too, is that I think that a lot of the other papers, as you pointed out, there's elements of that paper in other papers, and even Britain and France show up in other papers. China doesn't really. I think China feels very self-contained to our paper, and that doesn't necessarily reflect what my view of the role of China in the Cold War. Now, I can't expect everybody else to go ahead and put China into their papers, so I think that says to me that part of my job, our job, is to draw out some of those connections for ourselves, and maybe a little bit in this conversation of seminal moments, bolstering a little bit of that, okay, looking from this larger picture of the Cold War rivalry as a Soviet-U.S. rivalry in the Middle East, how can we add China and to sort of, because I always view after the Sino-Soviet split, the Cold War certainly has a third leg that you have to deal with in a very serious way. So what was the broader impact on that on the larger picture? I think something is that we can bolster.
Okay. I think that the strength of the volume is its plurality. So the bottom line is, even if we don't agree on what's the most important factor when we interpret the Cold War, if it's ideas or geostrategy or institutions or social movements, what comes through is that the various chapters complement each other. So, yeah. What comes through is that the various chapters complement each other. So I know, for example, I barely discussed the Aswan Dam. And I know that the development chapter does. I didn't discuss so much, let's say, communism and the activity of oil workers in the Middle East, but I know that in your chapter it would show up. So I think, yeah, the bottom line is that the plurality of the chapters, they complement each other, and for that reason, I don't think you should force a certain template on the chapter, on the chapters. Yes.
I will definitely have one-on-one talks with everybody to sort of see who perhaps really needs to do certain things, because otherwise they might be missing and they're really important, but also where there are overlaps, which is fine. I totally agree. I think, yes, sorry. Please, Rebecca.
Sorry, go ahead and finish your thought. I can jump in afterwards.
No, that's it.
She can't hear you, Cyrus. She can't hear you.
Please, yeah, it's all yours.
Okay, about this question of what to do with the multiple top-downs and bottom-ups and how they meet, it just occurred to me that I wonder whether it might be potentially useful or helpful to reframe that question as one about how we as historians move among different scales or trace global historical patterns in a particular place. Or in this case, a set of places that get imagined unevenly and messily as a region together. And then, of course, how all of this becomes linked to historical trajectories in other particular places at different times, like the example of China, etc. And I'm thinking about Gabrielle Hecht's work on interscalar vehicles, about how we move among and between a variety of different sets of scales. And the questions then that this opens about, well, any choice you make about place and scale is going to reveal some things and hide others. And so one of the really useful things that the volume and the task of writing these papers has done for me is to force me to ask what we can gain by insisting that we should look at this thing called the Cold War that is bigger than the MENA region, but what happens when we look at it in this fraught regional grouping called MENA. And that there is something to be gained by that. Of course, that it needs to be done with humility and caution and all the rest of it. And I love listening then to how everybody else is grappling with variations of this problem as well. So in case it's helpful to, I guess this is coming from a lot of the work environmental historians have done thinking about place, that it could in some way maybe be useful to think about whether this is really in some ways about movement through scale. I'm also thinking about Aaron Jakes and Ahmed Shoker's insistence that we should look at capitalism in Egypt, a global thing in a place, instead of this thing called Egyptian capitalism that's somehow sequestered from the whole. And the problem that they're trying to tackle of how to do justice to the fact that this is the reason we care about this history is that it is global in many ways, but it also looks a little different everywhere. Seems in some ways to be resonant with the problem we're grappling with. So I'll just throw that out there as a sort of preliminary thought that may or may not be helpful. And yeah, this is a great conversation. Thank you all.
I totally agree that, thinking about this through scale may be one way of bridging this different, or putting into one, let's say, putting into one single but heterogeneous sort of basket, these different sort of, perspectives. Yeah, I think this is something one needs to continue just thinking about, definitely. Shall we move on? Yes, please.
Yes, since we're one.
Yes,
one
yeah,
and
great,
two rounds,
actually.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I think that's really helpful. And I think that, I want to say a couple things. One is, the work that you're going to do is writing the introduction is really important for framing this. I tend to agree that we don't need to manufacture a kind of consensus or a kind of a broad reach across. I think to have this plurality of voices, as Guy is saying, I think it's really an important strategy, but your job is to kind of present the reader with the analytical tools to understand what this is. So I think the Ahmed Shoker and Aaron Jake's piece is a great example that I would say, you should do a little bit of helping the reader think about what is this very thing. I suggested Fred Cooper earlier as also thinking about what is modernity. We have lots of examples of people struggling with these sorts of questions that I would think would be really analytically fruitful to bring together for the reader. I want to say that, at the same time, there's going to be a lot of work for you to figure out, in a sense, how to order, even if you decide to order without dividing into sections. I think it's smart. But, the table of contents is an argument. So you do need to think about kind of what that's going to look like. I think we have a lot of overlap in our own chapter with a lot of things people have, Chris was just talking about our panel has a lot of direct things that are really connected. I would hesitate for any of us to start to delineate away from sharing that overlap in the chapters. Like, I think people are they may read, development and think, oh, maybe environment's another interesting, like that might be a reader. But I think that many people are going to assign one chapter here and there. And if it's really important, Osama, for you to talk about oil, I think you should talk about oil, because somebody only might read your chapter, and it's better to just put something in brackets that says, and if you want more on this, look over here. I wouldn't want to compromise the integrity of the argument, I guess is what I'm saying, by us trying to fit into some kind of a puzzle where we don't overlap too much. So I think for us, I'm speaking for Rebecca, but for me, it's been really just fruitful to be hearing what's on the radar, what people are talking about, what people are thinking about. I do think, for our paper, for example, you're going to want to go, if we're talking about something like the High Dam as a moment that's actually connected to the Arab-Israeli conflict, I would think you'd want to go and read Jeremy's chapter and oh, this is the whole story, or this is more of the story. There will be ways in which people will move across the chapters for context. But I think, unfortunately, this is an interesting discussion, but really the burden is on you, Cyrus, to think about this. I definitely think that I suggested to you last night this idea of the interleaving of the part one and part two. I think you have an opportunity to do something imaginative and creative that takes this volume out of the way we might see that division already existing in scholarship. So it might feel a little bit artificial to you at some points, and would environment go as a foundational thing, as something you really can understand later, because you've gotten the political story? I'm not sure. I think you could go either way. But I think that if you want this volume to be more than just an interesting collection of papers, but something that could be innovative and groundbreaking, this is one way I see that happening, along with really questioning, how do we do this global scalar, this global local, a thing in a place. So that would be my thought. Thank you.
Just two very, very quick, reactions. The first is that I really do think that the most substantive and actually only substantive way of creating a whole out of these parts is by using cross-references in the chapters. The TOC is important, yes, but ultimately it doesn't really matter. Right now it matters to us because we are in the process, so we're like, oh my God, this is so important. But ultimately people won't really care, right? But it will matter. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, because it does signal something, but it doesn't matter that much. That's point number one. And point number two is, I totally agree with the importance of looking at the plurality of the Cold War, the different things it means. Maybe we can use scale, or I can use scale to conceptualize it. Although I have a sort of a problem with this whole concept of scale, but that's my own sort of thing to work through. I also think, look, ultimately for me, the absolutely most core audience of this book is scholars of the Cold War, not scholars of MENA. MENA is important, but to me, ultimately, if I need to choose, ultimately, I want this to be the most important sort of, people whom I want basically to talk to is the Cold War people. Right? Because the MENA people will read this anyway. They anyway will do this, right? And that means in turn to me that the way I need to conceive of this plurality in the introduction needs to be built on the secondary literature that is understandable to these people. Right? If I use a body of literature to talk about this plurality that is totally alien to them, they're like, whatever, it's not going to matter to them. I'm not saying I need to slavishly reproduce what they're doing, but I need to build on them in order to do this. And this is already a conversation that is happening a lot. Like, you remember I talked about this 4-hour podcast that I listened to, they talked about this nonstop. But it's a question to them. It's not something that they have resolved. And so this is exactly the sort of conversation I need to refer and build on in order to frame what this plurality actually is.
Yeah, let me just really quickly say, I think you can use it as a way to reach out your hand and say, come into this particular context. Here are some things that are legible to you as Cold War scholars. These are some kind of entry points. And then once they're in, then that's your job to say, and this is also a new moment, a new opportunity for you to see something else. So I would encourage you, you have the capacity to do it, and I think it would be a really important innovation. But you're right, you can't just start from way over here and expect they're going to follow you in. You have to, as I say, use the literature review to kind of pull them in. I'm sorry to take a second time, but it's a cool question to be asking us, so thank you.
Yeah, I think I want to start exactly from this exchange. I mean, there is something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially today on this more thematic day, let's say, which is about, indeed, what would Cold War scholars understand about the Cold War, reading these specific chapters that they don't know already, or why is that relevant? And sometimes I think it was Chris's question to the panel of Tim and Jeremy. So what's the connection, not just between the two elements, but also with the Cold War? And I think in a way, this is a question that also can be relevant for other contributions too. So this definitional point and to, in a way that has to remain open, of course, we cannot solve it, but we can definitely address it, and I think it would be a major plus for the companion if you could do that. And then, not to put you on the spot, but I do have a question, which is, will we as contributors get a first draft of the introduction?
Yes, because this is actually, I want to write this introduction the next month.
Super.
But because I feel these drafts, I mean, the drafts will change some, but they won't really, they're not going to be radically different. So I feel I have enough now to basically write. Yeah.
So for Rebecca, who maybe didn't hear, but the answer was yes, and we will receive it. No, it's perfectly fine. But I think also, indeed, to stay in dialogue, not just between us contributors, which I think is crucial, and we need to coordinate that, of course, but also with you and with this general direction. I know that you just made this point about table of contents, so maybe this is not so crucial anymore, but I will mention it anyway, because when I saw the place of our contribution, let's say, within the West, so we were FRG and then the GDR in parentheses. Yeah, I don't know. I have, I guess what I'm trying to say is let's make sure that of course, there is just the FRG now, like there is only the Federal Republic, but let's be careful to avoid this sort of teleological reading, which of course I know you wouldn't do, but just to say that at least the way that I see it, it wasn't, we now know that the West won, but at that time, also in terms of perception and playing actors against each other, this very, very much worked. In terms, and Massimiliano, I'll give you the word in a second, but I think in terms of connections, I will never tire to say that the Arab-Israeli chapter for us is very important. And of course, development, and Massimiliano, I'm sure you can say more about that. The question of why is why are the Germans, contributing to projects such as ASWAN? I mean, I'm sure we will somehow have to, or want to connect these kinds of points. I think that this is essentially what I have to say. So, Massimiliano, please.
Yes, starting with the connections. As we have two states instead of one, and we're here, we banked our professional fate on two states instead of one. Thanks. Of course, we're going to connect, of course, to the U.S., to the Soviets, in all their shapes. Of course, to the other Europeans. Of course, because first, they were located in Europe, and second, as I tried to argue, in the moment in the 70s and 80s, they reframed their actions within their own regional gatherings, European communities, and Comecon and the others. Well, that's it. They need it. Of course, development, the other main connections, and their own kind of approach to development. These are, I think, of course, development and environment. in understanding that implementation of what environment matter. One thing that I truly believe that the Cold War got significance in from a global point of view in the very moment that it integrated with your macro historical processes. Because those macro historical processes were those who were of more significance to the people we are talking about, in the sense from a bottom up, okay? Meaning self-determination in terms of decolonization and sovereignty. And then, I would argue, development, just for my own sake. No? And that's it. And this is and this is the reason why I think that it would make full sense to try to still unite or keep all the contributions, the thematic ones and the more actor-based one to get together. And if I would be even more radical, to ask you to compel us, in particular those of the actors, to deal with these few macro historical processes and how we, the actors, integrated on this. And the bipolar rivalry is a macro historical processes, or at least one step within. And here, I refer to Giovanni Arrighi, a process of U.S. hegemonic cycle. But that's my suggestion even for Osama, as well as the minor role, which explained the minor role of the Soviets in the whole scheme, in the larger scheme of modern times.
Yeah, not so minor. I'd like to repeat that.
Okay, no,
we have a Cold War.
And here we relate maybe even suggestion for Chris when the chapter by Giovanni Arrighi on the Cambridge history of the Cold War, which is just a. Thank you.
Do I see it correctly, Osama? You're the last one who hasn't. No, I spoke. You spoke already.
Can I say something?
Yes, of course. Oh, yes, you've already started.
It works. It works. Maybe it's not my place, also because I'm very happy about the idea that we'll have more word count. But also, I thought, it's just a thought, that a chapter about the arms race, conventional arms race, nuclear arms race in the region, that could have been, like, if there's something the superpowers did, was fuel regional conflicts, the Arab-Israeli conflict being one of them, by arms sales. And that's,
there are all sorts of different ideas.
Right.
About what else can be done. And I agree, really, but I do think ultimately, I do think that, ultimately, I think it makes more sense to use the, let's say, 1,000 or 1,500 more words that everybody has, and make, for instance, in the Soviet chapter and in the American chapter, have a bit of reference to this, right? I think because 8,000 words as it is really isn't this much. We all know this, right? Yeah. Have I overlooked anybody? Has everybody spoken? I think we have, right? So, thank you everybody so much. Just to say, I am going to go maybe have a beer if anybody would like to join. Yes, Massimiliano is in. I still have to figure out where, but we can, figure that out. But really, it was a great pleasure and a great privilege to have all of you come here and think this through together. And I'm very much looking forward to the continuation of our work.
And in the name of all of us, thank you, Cyrus.
Cheers.